Welcome to Top 10 Secret. Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine while listening to ghost stories at midnight? The shadowy figures lurking in the dark, eerie whispers that send shivers through your body? Or mysterious events that defy explanation? Today, we're diving into 10 of the most terrifying and chilling ghost stories. Tales so haunting they might keep you up at night, make your heart race, and leave you afraid to turn off the lights. Do you have the guts to make it through this video? If so, let's uncover these spooky secrets together. But remember, don't watch alone. Story 1. The Hunger Demon. The town of Shimizu had always been shrouded in mystery. Nestled deep in the mountains of Japan, it was a place where the fog never truly lifted, and where the streets were always slick with the remnants of a constant ghostly drizzle. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of something that lurked in the alleys at night, a creature cursed by hunger, forever seeking its next victim. The elders knew it by name: Gaki no Yoru, the Hunger Demon. It was said that long ago, during a famine, a man of great wealth hoarded his food while the rest of the village starved. When the desperate villagers came to him for help, he turned them away, laughing at their suffering as he feasted. But the gods had been watching. One by one, the villagers perished, their bodies piling in the streets, their hollow eyes staring into the heavens. But before their final breaths, they spoke a curse upon the greedy man, that he would never know satisfaction again, that his hunger would grow into something unnatural, something monstrous. On the night of the next full moon, the man's screams echoed through the town. His skin stretched thin over his bones, his limbs elongated, his fingers sharpened into claws, and his tongue grew long enough to drag along the ground. His hunger became insatiable. And so, the legend began. Every few years, when the moon was at its fullest and the rain poured onto the streets of Shimizu, the demon would return, its ragged form skulking through the alleys, searching for flesh to devour. And those who saw its golden eyes staring from the darkness never lived to tell the tale. The town remained silent about the legend. Outsiders rarely visited, and those who did never stayed long. But there were always those who refused to believe. One such man was Hiroshi Nakamura, an urban explorer and paranormal investigator with a large following online. He had heard rumors of the Hunger Demon and saw an opportunity. If he could capture footage of the entity, he would gain worldwide recognition. He ignored the warnings of the villagers and set out into the streets on the night of the full moon, determined to uncover the truth. As Hiroshi wandered through the rain-drenched alleys, he noticed something unsettling. The town seemed too quiet. No lights in the windows, no movement, no sound except for the rain tapping against the rooftops. It was as if the entire village was holding its breath. Then, he heard a wet slithering sound. He spun around, camera trembling in his hands. His flashlight barely pierced the dense mist, but within the fog, something moved. A shadow, impossibly thin and unnaturally long, darted from one alley to another. His heart pounded as he zoomed in with his camera. And then, the whispers began. "So hungry, so empty, will you feed me?" A voice that was neither near nor far, echoing from all directions. Hiroshi swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. A shape began to materialize at the end of the alley. It was hunched, its limbs twitching unnaturally. Its golden eyes locked onto him, and its lips curled back into an unnatural grin. Then, with impossible speed, it rushed forward. Hiroshi screamed and stumbled backward, barely avoiding the swipe of its claws. His camera fell to the ground, capturing only a glimpse of its grotesque form before it was swallowed by the mist. He ran, blindly, desperately, weaving through the alleys, trying to escape. But no matter where he turned, he kept ending up back at the same shrine where he started. It was as if the streets had twisted around him, trapping him in a maze of darkness and rain. The footsteps behind him grew closer. He threw himself against the shrine doors and burst inside, collapsing onto the cold wooden floor. The air was thick with incense, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that danced along the walls. Outside, the rain stopped. The silence was suffocating. Then, the door behind him creaked open. Hiroshi turned slowly, every nerve in his body screaming at him to run, but he was frozen in place. The demon stood in the doorway, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, its tongue writhing like a snake. The air grew thick with the scent of rotting meat. It spoke again. "You brought yourself here. That means you are mine." Hiroshi tried to scream, but before he could, the demon's tongue shot forward, wrapping around his throat. It yanked him into the darkness, his body disappearing into the gaping maw. The next morning, the villagers found Hiroshi's camera sitting on the shrine steps. Its screen cracked, its battery drained. The footage showed Hiroshi running, panicking, gasping for breath, and in the final seconds of the recording, his own face stared back at the camera. But his eyes were now hollow voids, his mouth stretched into a sickening grin. The hunger demon had claimed another. That night, the rain continued to fall, and in the alleys of Shimizu, the whispering never stopped. Story 2. The Graveyard Curse. Raven Hollow was a cursed town, buried deep in the mist-covered valleys of the north. For centuries, no one dared to enter its graveyard after nightfall. The village elders warned of the entity that lurked there, a shadow of death itself. It was known by many names: the Gravekeeper, the Watcher, the Reaper of Souls. But to those who had seen it and lived to tell the tale, it was simply known as the Hollow One. A being taller than any man, its presence swallowed the light, cloaked in eternal darkness. It had no face, only two burning blue eyes that shone like lanterns in the abyss. And its hands, long skeletal fingers ending in claws sharp enough to tear flesh from bone, were always outstretched, reaching, grasping. Those who saw the Hollow One never left the graveyard alive. For centuries, the village obeyed one rule: never step into the graveyard after dark, until the night 4 strangers came to test the legend. It began as a dare. Adam, Lucy, Ben, and Eric, 4 friends who had heard of the legend online, arrived at Raven Hollow seeking thrills. They were ghost hunters, or so they called themselves, always chasing after folklore, determined to prove the supernatural was just superstition. "It's just a story," Adam scoffed, hoisting his camera onto his shoulder. "Nothing's going to happen." Lucy shivered, pulling her jacket closer. "Then why do the villagers look so terrified whenever we mention the graveyard?" "Because fear spreads like a disease," Eric said. "It's psychological. People convince themselves they see things in the dark." Ben chuckled. "Well, let's see if we can catch something real this time." They crossed through the rusted iron gates at exactly midnight. And the moment they stepped inside, the wind died. The air was thick with something ancient. The trees that lined the graveyard were blackened and dead, their skeletal limbs twisting upward as if trying to claw their way out of the earth. A dense fog slithered across the ground, curling around the cracked tombstones like fingers of the dead. Somewhere, deep in the mist, a whisper echoed. Lucy froze. "Did you hear that?" "It's just the wind," Adam muttered, adjusting his camera. But the others weren't so sure. The whisper came again, closer this time. A slow, hollow voice slithering through the fog. "You shouldn't be here." Ben laughed nervously. "Okay, I'll admit, That was creepy. But it's probably just the wind through the trees. Let's split up and explore. The group hesitated, but eventually agreed. Adam and Lucy went toward the older gravestones, while Eric and Ben wandered toward the large crypts. Minutes passed in uneasy silence. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Then, from the fog, something moved. A shadow, towering and impossibly large, shifted between the gravestones. Its glowing blue eyes flickered like dying embers. Ben grabbed Eric's arm. "Do you see that?" Before Eric could answer, a hand burst from the darkness and grabbed Ben by the throat. Eric screamed as his friend was ripped into the fog. The last thing Ben saw was those terrible blue eyes staring into his soul. Then came the sound of bones snapping like twigs. Eric ran blindly through the mist, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. He saw Adam and Lucy ahead, waving their flashlights frantically. "Run," he choked out. "It's real, it's—" Then the fog shifted, and Ben stepped out. But something was wrong. His skin was too pale, his eyes hollow and empty, his mouth stretched into a twisted smile too wide for his face. "Where are you going, Eric?" he whispered, voice layered with something inhuman. Lucy screamed. Ben lunged. Adam swung his flashlight, and for a split second they saw it. The Hollow One. It loomed over them, its form shifting between shadow and flesh, too large, too monstrous. Its burning blue eyes locked onto them, freezing them in place. And then it spoke. "You came uninvited. Now you will stay forever." The air around them cracked. The ground split open. A terrible wailing filled the night as skeletal hands burst from the graves, clawing their way upward, pulling the living into the earth. Lucy was the next to be taken. The hands grabbed her ankles, dragging her screaming into a freshly opened grave. Adam ran. He didn't stop. He didn't look back, but he never saw the shadow behind him. The Hollow One reached out with long, clawed fingers, and Adam was no more. At sunrise, the townspeople ventured into the graveyard. They found 4 new graves, the earth still fresh. And at the center of the cemetery, Adam's camera lay untouched. When they played back the footage, all they could hear was breathing. And then, in the final frame, just before the camera cut to static, a figure loomed in the mist, cloaked in darkness, watching, waiting. Its eyes burned blue, and it whispered, "More will come." Story 3. The Curse of the Gravekeeper. Long ago, before Forgotten Hollow became a cursed graveyard, it was once a peaceful village. But everything changed when a gruesome massacre took place. A cult devoted to darkness sacrificed the entire population to summon an ancient entity. The only survivor of that fateful night was a gravedigger, a nameless man, forced to bury the innocent townsfolk. But when he completed his work, a new nightmare began. He could not die. The man was cursed to become the gravekeeper, an entity no longer belonging to this world, doomed to wander among the tombs forever, hunting down anyone who dared trespass on his domain. In 2023, a group of college students, Jake, Linda, Michael, and Sarah, decided to visit Forgotten Hollow to film a documentary about its local legend. They had heard countless stories about the graveyard, but dismissed them as mere superstition. "This is just an old cemetery. There are no ghosts," Jake scoffed, priding himself on his skepticism. They entered the cemetery at midnight. Their flashlights barely pierced the thick fog, which swallowed every beam of light. The gravestones stood crooked, overgrown with wild grass, while an inexplicable foul stench filled the air. Sarah, the camerawoman, suddenly froze. She muttered, "Do you see that? There's someone over there." The group turned in the direction she pointed. A tall, shadowy figure, clad in a tattered cloak, stood motionless among the tombstones. "It's probably just an old statue," Michael said, though his voice wavered. Jake stepped forward to examine it. As his flashlight illuminated the figure, they saw a skeletal form wrapped in a cloak, its hollow face bearing two empty, soulless sockets. Then it moved. A bony hand slowly lifted, pointing straight at them. The wind howled violently. A voice, hoarse and filled with the wails of thousands of tormented souls, rang out. "You should not be here." Panic-stricken, the group bolted. But they soon realized that the path they had taken had vanished. The cemetery now stretched endlessly in all directions. Sarah tripped and screamed as she felt a cold, skeletal hand wrap around her ankle. Linda rushed to help, but the moment she touched Sarah, she shrieked in horror. Sarah's flesh began to dissolve, revealing dark, writhing veins like living serpents. Michael dragged Linda away, abandoning Sarah. Her screams were abruptly silenced as her body was sucked into the earth, leaving only a pool of blackened blood behind. "We can't die here," Jake gasped, his hands trembling. They desperately searched for an escape. Then, from the shadows, a chilling laugh echoed. The gravekeeper was approaching, his hollow eyes as deep as the abyss. A voice whispered in their minds, "Look upon those who came before you." The fog thickened, and from within it, grotesque figures emerged. The damned, those who had once entered this place, stood before them, their twisted faces frozen in agony, their decayed bodies barely holding together, their bleeding eyes filled with eternal suffering. Michael shrieked as one of the figures reached for him. In an instant, his flesh was stretched, then violently torn apart, as if unseen hands were slicing him piece by piece. He screamed as his body was distorted into an unrecognizable shape before vanishing into darkness. Jake and Linda ran. But it was useless. An invisible barrier blocked every route. Jake cried out in despair. "We were wrong. Please spare us." The gravekeeper stood before them. He reached out. Linda collapsed, her eyes widening in horror as her flesh shriveled, then peeled away in strips. Jake barely had time to scream before the only things left were two lifeless skeletons, buried alive beneath the cemetery soil. But the story did not end there. Year after year, curious souls ventured to Forgotten Hollow. None ever returned. Yet recently, something strange happened. An old journal surfaced in an abandoned bookstore, detailing the events of Jake's group. Who wrote the journal? Could one of them still be alive? Or was this merely another trick of the gravekeeper, luring fresh victims into his domain? And if you ever stumble upon that book, be careful. He's watching you. Story 4: The Hand from Hell. The village of Ravenshire was no stranger to darkness. Legends of restless spirits and ancient curses plagued its history, but none were as terrifying as the legend of the Hand from Hell. It was said that once every 100 years, when the moon turned blood red, the cursed earth would crack open, and a hand, blackened, withered, and grotesquely elongated, would rise from the grave, searching for a soul to drag into the abyss. No one knew whose hand it was, but the elders whispered that it belonged to the Forgotten One, a monstrous being buried alive centuries ago by the fearful townsfolk. His crime? Unnatural rituals, sacrifices made to unholy entities, and the unforgivable sin of seeking to conquer death itself. His body had been chained beneath the oldest grave in Raven's Hollow Cemetery, but his spirit had never truly left. The warning had always been clear: stay away from the graveyard when the blood moon rises. But curiosity, as always, was the downfall of fools. That fateful night, Samuel Holloway, an arrogant skeptic, scoffed at the superstitions. A writer obsessed with disproving myths, he ventured into the cemetery alone, armed with only a lantern and a notebook. The village elders pleaded with him, their eyes sunken with fear, but he laughed in their faces. "Stories made to scare children," he muttered. "Nothing more." As midnight struck, an unnatural silence blanketed the cemetery. The wind stopped. The rustling leaves froze midair. Samuel's breath clouded in the eerie stillness. Then, the ground beneath him trembled. A horrific, wet tearing sound filled the air as the soil split apart. From the depths of the grave, something stirred. The blackened hand burst forth, its grotesque fingers stretching toward the sky. Tendrils of rotting flesh still clung to its bones, and its nails were long, jagged, and razor-sharp. It moved unnaturally, twitching, spasming, as if it was adjusting to life once more. Samuel, frozen in sheer terror, watched as the skeletal appendage clawed at the air. Then, it turned. It knew he was there. Samuel tried to run, but his feet refused to move. A voice, low, guttural, and filled with centuries of hatred, whispered into his mind. "You have awakened me, and now you will take my place." Suddenly, the hand shot forward, stretching across the cemetery in an impossible motion. It wrapped around Samuel's ankle with an iron grip, its icy touch seeping into his bones. He screamed, kicking wildly, but the fingers only tightened, dragging him toward the open grave. The soil churned like a living thing, writhing and pulsating. Faces, distorted, wailing, their eyes hollow, emerged from the dirt, their mouths twisted in agony. They reached for him, clawing at his flesh, their whispers echoing in a chorus of madness. "Join us. Become one of us." Samuel's screams grew hoarse as the darkness swallowed him. The last thing he saw before being dragged into the abyss was the hand, now fully risen, attached to something far worse than he could ever imagine. A rotting figure, still wrapped in ancient chains, pulled itself free from the grave. Its skull-like face turned toward the village, and its empty eye sockets burned with an unnatural crimson light. The Forgotten One had returned, and Ravenshire would never be the same again. The next morning, the townspeople found Samuel's lantern, its glass cracked, its flame extinguished. The earth where he had stood was now solid once more, no trace of a grave disturbed. But something had changed. The old cemetery was no longer silent. The air crackled with unseen energy, and at night, whispers drifted through the village. Shadows moved when no one was there to cast them. And most chilling of all, the villagers began to see a lone figure standing among the graves, watching. Some claimed it was Samuel. Others swore it was something else, something waiting for the next fool to take its place. As nights passed, strange occurrences became more frequent. Children would wake screaming from night terrors, claiming they saw a skeletal hand reaching for them from under their beds. The village livestock began dying mysteriously, their bodies found in grotesque, twisted positions, their eyes wide with terror. The well water turned thick and black for several nights, forcing the villagers to fetch water from the distant river. Then, the disappearances began. At first, it was the animals. Dogs, cattle, even birds seemed to vanish into thin air. Then the children started to go missing. First, little Eliza Turner, who had been playing by the cemetery's edge. Then Joseph Wright, whose mother swore she had only turned her back for a moment. Soon, the village was consumed by dread. The elders knew what was happening but refused to speak of it, whispering prayers and marking their doors with old symbols meant to ward off the dead. One night, Marion Holloway, Samuel's sister, awoke to a scratching sound against her window. She hesitated, heart pounding, before creeping toward it. The full moon cast an eerie glow over the village, illuminating a tall, gaunt figure standing just beyond the trees. Its head twitched unnaturally. Then, with agonizing slowness, it raised its hand. Samuel's hand. Marion stumbled back in horror, knocking over a candle. When she looked again, the figure was gone. But deep in her soul, she knew it had seen her. It would come for her next. The blood moon was rising once more. The village of Ravenshire was never found on any modern map. Those who sought it only found a ruinous land, devoid of life, with the remains of long-forgotten graves marking where the town had once stood. But some travelers, brave or foolish enough to spend the night near its borders, claimed to have heard the whispers of the Forgotten One, still searching for another soul. And if you dare to listen too closely, you might just hear the sound of fingernails dragging across the dirt, searching, waiting. And the blood moon would rise again, and would. Story 5. Nightmare in the Abyss. There are games that should never be played, legends that should never be unearthed. Some stories are buried not because they are forgotten, but because they are too horrifying to be remembered. Yet some nightmares have a way of creeping back into the minds of the curious, crawling from the void to claim new victims. This is the story of Super Mario Rapture, a game that was never meant to exist. Chris wasn't just an ordinary gamer, he was obsessed. His love for Mario games wasn't just casual fandom, it was a hunger. He had played every version, collected every hidden item, and uncovered every obscure Easter egg. He thought he had seen it all, until he found Super Mario Rapture. It was buried deep in the dark corners of the internet, hidden away like a festering wound. A single download link, accompanied only by a cryptic warning. Do not play after midnight. Do not reach the final level. And whatever you do, do not let him see you. Chris smirked. Urban legends were nothing new. He had played countless haunted ROM hacks before. None of them had ever delivered anything more than cheap jump scares and broken code. He clicked download. That was his first mistake. The game booted up normally, at first. The title screen was eerily similar to Super Mario World, except the colors were off. The sky was a sickly green, and Mario himself looked different. His eyes weren't the usual cheerful blue, but an unnatural shade of deep, bleeding red. Chris pressed start. The first few levels played just like the classic Mario game, but something felt wrong. The enemies didn't move as they should. They twitched, glitched, and sometimes froze in place before jerking forward violently. The background music was distorted, as if being played underwater, and in some areas, it was replaced by what sounded like distant, muffled screaming. But the real horror began when Chris reached level 4 to 6. The moment he entered, the screen flickered. The world around Mario became dark, the ground turning into writhing masses of flesh. The hills in the background had eyes, unblinking and soulless. The music was gone, replaced by a low, guttural whispering that seemed to breathe through the speakers. And then, Mario stopped moving. Chris didn't press anything, yet Mario stood there, his pixelated head twitching slightly. Then, ever so slowly, he turned to face the screen. His mouth stretched into a jagged, tooth-filled grin. His pupils shrank into pinpricks of burning red. And then, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Chris screamed as the screen went black. The game shut off on its own. Chris sat frozen, his heart hammering. He took deep breaths, forcing himself to laugh. "It's just a hack," he muttered. "Someone programmed that to mess with players." He rebooted his computer. The game opened by itself. There was no title screen this time, no music. Just Mario, standing in an endless void, staring directly at him. A new message appeared in blood-red text. "I can see you." The webcam light flicked on. Chris's blood turned to ice. He never turned it on. He reached to shut his laptop, but his fingers stopped inches away. The screen was changing. The pixels warped, shifting like something was crawling beneath them. The static grew louder, turning into something wet, something breathing. And then Mario stepped out of the screen. The next morning, Chris's friends went looking for him. His apartment was silent. The door was unlocked. Inside, the computer screen flickered with static. The room smelled of rotting flesh. The walls were covered in deep scratches, as if something with razor-sharp claws had been trying to escape. But Chris was gone. All that remained was his laptop, still open to a single message on the screen. "Now I am free." Days passed, and Chris's friends started receiving strange emails, messages containing nothing but a single link. "Download Super Mario Rapture?" Some clicked, some played. None were ever seen again. And somewhere deep within the void, Mario smiled. The blood moon was rising, and he was waiting. The emails didn't stop. More people began to receive them. Random names from Chris's contact list, some close friends, some distant acquaintances. Even people who had never met him found the link sitting in their inbox. One of them was Michael, Chris's best friend. He had been worried about Chris's disappearance and had spent days trying to piece together what happened. When the email arrived in his inbox, he felt his stomach lurch. He hovered over the link. His hand trembled, but curiosity gnawed at his resolve. He needed to know. He clicked. The game downloaded instantly. Michael hesitated. The warning still lingered in his mind, but something deep inside him urged him forward. He double-clicked the file. The screen flickered to life. The title screen was different this time. Mario was waiting for him. His face was rotting. His smile was too wide. His eyes burned with hunger. Michael had just made the last mistake of his life, and Mario was free to play again. Story 6. The Hell Rider's Curse. There are roads that no man should travel, places that have been swallowed by time, their names spoken only in fearful whispers. Somewhere deep in the wastelands, past the ruins of forgotten towns, there is a stretch of road known only as the Devil's Spine. No map marks its location. No traveler tells the tale of riding it and returning. And those who do stumble upon it by accident are never seen again. Jasper Crowley was not a man who believed in legends. A hardened outlaw, he had spent his life cheating death, running from the law and making his name one to be feared. But that night, under a crimson moon, he rode into the darkness of the Devil's Spine and rode straight into hell. The town of Grim Hollow was once a bustling settlement, but now it was a skeleton of its former self. The wooden buildings had rotted, their windows hollow and black. The streets were empty, save for the bones of those who had vanished long ago. No voices, no wind, just silence. A silence so deep it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Jasper pulled his horse to a stop, his gloved fingers tightening around the reins. Something felt wrong. The air smelled of burnt metal and decay. His horse, a battle-hardened beast, pawed nervously at the dirt, nostrils flaring. Then, in the distance, he heard it, the slow, rhythmic sound of hooves on stone. Jasper turned, his hand instinctively going to his revolver. From the blackened mist at the far end of the town, something moved. A rider, tall, motionless, perched atop a nightmare of a horse, its ribs poking through blackened flesh, its eyes nothing but pits of burning embers. The figure atop it was not human. A skeletal cowboy, his bones wrapped in scorched, cracked flesh. A long white beard framed his leering skull, and beneath the brim of his weathered hat, 2 eyes burned like dying suns. Jasper's breath hitched. He had heard of the Hell Rider, a demon said to haunt the desert roads, a spirit that hunted men whose sins had gone unpaid. But he had never believed. Not until now. The rider lifted one hand, a long, gnarled claw of bone, and pointed at Jasper. The wind howled. The torches lining the empty streets burst into flames. Jasper's horse reared, screaming, but the sound was drowned out by the shriek of something unnatural, something that did not belong in this world. A deep, guttural voice rumbled through the town, a voice that did not belong to the living. "You have been chosen." Jasper didn't wait to hear more. He spurred his horse hard, turning on his heel, galloping toward the end of the town. He didn't look back. He should have, because the Hell Rider did not stay behind. The hoofbeats behind him grew louder. No matter how fast Jasper rode, the thing was keeping up. Shadows bled from its figure, stretching like claws, reaching for him. The air grew heavy, like the weight of 1,000 graves pressing against his chest. Jasper gasped, his vision darkening, his fingers numb. His horse faltered, screaming as something unseen tore into its flesh. Then Jasper felt it. A burning grip wrapping around his throat. The world spun. The sky above him cracked like shattered glass. The crimson moon expanded, twisting and writhing like a living thing. The buildings of Grim Hollow burned, the town collapsing in on itself like a gaping, hungry mouth. Then everything went black. Jasper woke up on his back, staring at the endless sky. His body was cold. Too cold. Slowly, he sat up. His fingers dug into the dirt beneath him. But it wasn't dirt. It was ash. He turned his head and saw his own body lying motionless beside him. His skin had blackened, his face frozen in a silent scream. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then he saw the rider standing before him. The skeletal figure loomed over Jasper, its empty sockets staring deep into his soul. "Now you ride for me." The Hell Rider extended a bony hand, and Jasper felt his soul ripped from his dead body, sucked into a swirling void of fire and torment. Pain unlike anything he had ever known tore through him, reshaping him, remaking him. And then, in a blaze of hellfire, Jasper Crowley was gone. A new rider sat atop the demon horse. His bones gleamed under the blood moon. His beard, once a sign of his mortal pride, was now charred and twisted. His eyes, 2 pits of endless burning agony, locked onto the horizon. His purpose was clear. He would ride, and he would hunt, and he would never stop. Story 7. The Crypt of the Blood Moon. Lord. Beneath the sky stained with blood, under the eternal night where no stars shone, lay a place forgotten by time. A place of whispers, a burial ground of cursed souls, where an ancient horror slumbered. It was called the Crypt of the Blood Moon Lord, a name spoken only in hushed tones by those who still remembered the legends. Centuries ago, an ancient cult worshipped the Blood Moon Lord, a being beyond human comprehension. He was no mere vampire, no mere demon. He was something older, something that had existed before the first breath of humanity. He fed on not just blood, but the very essence of the soul, consuming life itself, leaving behind only hollow shells, bodies that walked, spoke, but were no longer alive. The cult dedicated their existence to him, offering sacrifices and rituals that made the very earth weep blood. It was said that once, when the moon turned red for 7 nights straight, the Blood Moon Lord walked the earth. And for those nights, an entire kingdom disappeared. Every man, woman, and child wiped from existence, their screams swallowed by the void. In desperation, the ancient kings waged war against the cult, slaughtering them in a single night, sealing their master inside a coffin forged from the bones of the fallen, locked away in a crypt buried beneath a cursed valley. And to ensure he never rose again, they placed upon the land a terrible curse. Any who disturbed the tomb would forfeit their soul. But time erodes all things, and greed knows no bounds. Lucas Hale was not a man of faith. He was an archaeologist, a man of science, a seeker of lost things. He had spent years chasing myths, unraveling ancient puzzles, proving that the monsters of folklore were nothing more than exaggerated tales told by frightened men. Then he found the Valley of Eternal Shadow. The signs were all there, forgotten texts, ruins that did not match the timeline of recorded history, whispering voices in the desert winds. And then there was the map, the one he had found hidden in the archives of a forbidden library, a relic written in a language that no living tongue could speak. "This is it," he told his team as they stood before the entrance. "The Crypt of Legends, the resting place of the Blood Moon Lord." It took weeks of excavation. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. Fossilized remains of things that were not human, glyphs depicting horrific rituals, paintings of a towering figure cloaked in shadow, surrounded by creatures that had no eyes, no mouths, only endless hunger. Then, finally, they found the coffin. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, blacker than the void, adorned with pulsating veins that seemed to throb like a living thing. The very air around it was thick, suffocating, humming with unseen energy. Their instruments malfunctioned, their cameras cracked. But Lucas was too blinded by his obsession to stop. He ignored the rising dread, the way his team shifted uneasily, the whispering voices that grew louder the closer they got. Then the first death happened. Gareth, one of his closest colleagues, screamed in agony as his body contorted, his bones snapping one by one as something inside him tried to crawl out. His mouth stretched open far beyond what should have been possible, and from within him crawled a mass of writhing, chitinous limbs, a thing that should not have existed. His empty skin collapsed to the ground as the thing slithered away into the darkness. Panic erupted. But it was too late. The coffin was opening. The ground shook violently. The air grew thick with the stench of decay. And then, slowly, the lid of the coffin began to slide open. A hand emerged first, long, withered, the flesh stretched too thin over impossibly long fingers. Then a face, sunken ancient, with empty sockets where eyes should have been. But within those sockets burned a crimson glow, not light, but hunger. Then he rose, towering over them, his presence alone suffocating, bending reality itself. "I have waited long enough," he whispered, his voice crawling into their minds like insects burrowing into flesh. The team screamed, but their voices did not reach the air. The sound died in their throats, swallowed by the oppressive darkness that radiated from the being before them. Then the slaughter began. The Blood Moon Lord did not kill them in the way mortals understood death. No, he unmade them. He touched them, and they unraveled, their bodies peeling apart like threads of fabric, their souls devoured. Those who tried to run found themselves trapped, the walls shifting, reshaping, the crypt no longer a place but a living thing, feeding on their terror. And from the shadows, they emerged, the children of the Blood Moon Lord, creatures made of twisting limbs, eyeless, mouthing silent prayers to a god that had no mercy. Lucas, barely clinging to his sanity, staggered back, watching his team be erased from existence. He should have run. He should have tried to escape. But the Lord of the Blood Moon looked at him, and in that moment, he knew. His fate had already been decided. The world outside would not be spared. The curse that had kept the monster imprisoned was shattered. And as the Blood Moon Lord ascended into the night, the sky itself bled, and from the distant cities, the screams began. The moon would turn red again, and humanity would drown in its wake. The end? Story 8: God of the Wasteland. The land was dead, not in the way of barren deserts or forsaken ruins, but in the way that something had been taken from it, ripped away, leaving behind an emptiness more horrifying than decay. No wind blew through the jagged rock formations. No whispers of lost souls disturbed the silence. Even time seemed to hesitate here, reluctant to move forward. Through this wasteland, a lone figure walked, wrapped in tattered black robes that trailed behind him like creeping shadows. He moved with the slow, deliberate steps of one who no longer feared the passage of time. His face, hidden beneath the heavy hood, had long forgotten warmth. The only thing that remained was purpose, a single maddening drive that had guided his footsteps for what felt like eternity. And now, at last, he had arrived. Before him loomed a monolith of bone and ruin, its form grotesque yet mesmerizing. A colossal skull, half buried in the desolate earth, as if it had fallen from the sky long ago. But it had not been buried by time. It had been placed here, bound in chains of darkness, suspended in the frozen stillness of a forgotten god's demise. The figure lifted a skeletal hand, pressing his fingers against the massive bone. The moment his touch met the cracked surface, a wave of memory flooded his mind. A war. Not between mortals, but between gods. Blades of celestial fire clashing against abyssal darkness. Beasts of shadow wailing in agony as their masters fell one by one. A great betrayal, a desperate sacrifice, and at the center of it all, him, the one they had feared, the one they had cast down, the devourer. And now, his prison had been found. A whisper rippled through the still air. "You came to wake me." The hooded figure did not answer. He didn't need to. The ground trembled as cracks split through the massive skull. The iron chains groaned, their ancient enchantments faltering. The sky above darkened, the color bleeding from the heavens like a wound spilling its last breath. Then came the laughter, deep, hollow, endless. The wasteland, once silent, now screamed. A river of black tendrils burst from the fissures in the ground, writhing and snapping like starving beasts. They clawed at the sky, latching onto the remains of their fallen master. Bone reformed. Flesh twisted itself into being, and from the ruins of the skull, something began to rise. The hooded figure stepped back as the presence of the god expanded, swallowing the landscape in suffocating dread. The very air became thick, pressing against his lungs as the entity fully awoke. Eyes formed where there should have been none. Mouths opened in places that had never known hunger. The thing that had once been imprisoned was now whole once more. And the world would never be the same again. Far beyond the wasteland, in the last remnants of civilization, people looked to the sky in terror. The stars, once familiar and eternal, shifted, rearranging themselves into patterns unknown to human understanding. Priests collapsed in temples, their bodies convulsing as unseen forces whispered secrets into their ears. The dead stirred in their graves. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth, ancient things that had long been forgotten began to wake. The god of the wasteland had returned, and he was hungry. Story 9, Black Blood Blade, The Curse of the Death Wanderer. The land had long been forsaken, cursed by centuries of war and bloodshed. No grass grew here, no animals roamed, only the skeletal remains of forgotten warriors, their bodies left to decay in the silence of an unmarked grave. The air was thick with the scent of rusted iron and dried blood, a wasteland where no man should tread. And yet, through the suffocating stillness, he walked. Draped in a tattered black cloak, his face was hidden beneath a hood of darkness. But beneath that veil, his flesh had long rotted away. Where there should have been eyes, there were only empty sockets burning with a crimson glow. Where there should have been lips, there was only the grotesque grin of a skull stained with old blood. And in his hand, he gripped the black blood blade, a cursed weapon, forever thirsting for souls. Legends called him the Death Wanderer, a being neither living nor dead. He was said to be a fallen warrior, a man betrayed by his own kin, struck down in battle and denied both life and the peace of death. The hatred in his soul was so great that the gods themselves refused to claim him, condemning him to roam the world as a harbinger of doom. The black blood blade, once a holy relic, had been tainted by his rage, absorbing the life force of every soul it touched, growing stronger with every kill. And now, he hunted again. In the shadow of a blood-red moon, a group of mercenaries made camp near the ruins of an abandoned fortress. They were men of violence, bandits, killers, and deserters who had turned to the trade of war for profit. They did not believe in curses, nor did they fear the whispers of ghosts. To them, the Death Wanderer was nothing more than a tale told to frighten children. A mistake they would not live to regret. As the wind howled through the valley, the first sign of his presence appeared. The fire they had built flickered wildly, then was suddenly snuffed out, leaving only darkness. The horses, seasoned war animals, began to scream in terror, their eyes rolling white with fear. A chilling silence followed, thick and unnatural, pressing down upon the men like the weight of an unseen hand. Then came the sound, a slow, deliberate scrape, metal dragging against stone. The leader of the group, a scarred brute named Garen, reached for his sword, barking orders to his men. "Stay sharp, something's out there." But before any of them could react, a shadow moved. A black figure appeared at the edge of the firelight, his skeletal grin illuminated by the blood moon above. The mercenaries barely had time to draw their weapons before he struck. The black blood blade sang through the air, slicing through flesh and bone like parchment. The first mercenary was cut in half, his body collapsing in a spray of crimson mist. The second barely had time to scream before the blade found his throat, his lifeblood spilling onto the earth. Panic erupted. The remaining men charged, swords flashing in the darkness, but their steel was worthless. The Death Wanderer moved like a shadow, his body twisting and vanishing into the void before reappearing behind them. Each swing of his cursed weapon drained the very essence from their bodies, their screams turning into ghastly wails as their souls were devoured. One by one, they fell. The ground was slick with gore, the scent of death thick in the air. Garen, the last survivor, staggered back, his breath ragged as he stared into the hollow eyes of the specter before him. "What? What are you?" he choked out, voice shaking. The Death Wanderer tilted his head, the sockets of his skull flickering with something akin to amusement. "I am vengeance." With a final, effortless swing, the black blood blade took Garen's head. And then, silence. The Death Wanderer stood amidst the carnage, watching as the souls of the fallen were absorbed into his weapon. The blade pulsed, its hunger momentarily sated. But it would not last. It was never enough. Legends say that the Death Wanderer will never stop. He cannot be killed. He cannot be bargained with. He walks the earth in search of vengeance, forever feeding the black blood blade, forever bound to the suffering he once endured. Some say he seeks the one who betrayed him, a soul lost to time, hidden among the living. Others believe he has no purpose left, only the endless hunger for blood and death. But all who see him know one thing. When the black blood blade is drawn, there is no escape. The blood moon will rise again. The wind will howl with the cries of the damned. And somewhere in the shadows, he will be watching. If you ever find yourself walking alone in a desolate land and the fire in your camp suddenly dies, run, because he has found you, and the Death Wanderer never stops. Story 10, Warlord of Hell. Deep beneath the crust of the dying earth, where rivers of molten fire carved through the bones of the forgotten, a being long thought lost to time stirred. It had no heart, no soul, and yet it breathed. The great chains that had bound him for millennia trembled, their runes flickering as the curse that once held him began to weaken. Vorak, Warlord of Hell, was waking up. Legends whispered of his fall, of how the gods themselves had descended upon him, fearing his wrath. No mortal could stand against him. No army could match his destruction. And so, rather than slay him, the gods had banished him, chained him in the abyss, locked beneath the world so that his fury would never again touch the land of the living. But humanity was foolish. Humanity was desperate. A kingdom on the brink of ruin, driven to madness by ceaseless war, had turned to ancient and forbidden texts. They sought a weapon, a force powerful enough to decimate their enemies. They sought him, and they called his name. The first screams began before the ground even cracked. When Vorak emerged, it was not like a mortal waking from slumber. It was like a wound reopening, like a chasm of rage splitting across the land. The sky burned with crimson fire, and black storm clouds churned as if they themselves feared what had been unleashed. He stood before the trembling mages who had summoned him, their eyes reflecting both awe and horrified realization. They had expected a warrior. They had expected a force they could control. They had doomed themselves. Vorak's warhammer swung in a great arc, and in a single moment, the summoners, once men of power, were reduced to nothing but twisted remnants. The very stone beneath their feet shattered from the force, the runes of their circle burning away as if never there. And then he moved. Through cities, through kingdoms, through anything that stood in his path. Vorak burned the world. The gods were silent, watching as their mistake unraveled once more. The mortals prayed, but there was no answer. Only the sound of chains dragging, the sound of bones crushing, the sound of war unending. They had wanted a weapon. They had awakened annihilation. The sky bled for 7 days and 7 nights as Vorak's rampage continued. Entire cities fell into chasms of fire, swallowed by the wrath of the warlord. His chains, now broken, became his weapon. Serpents of steel that lashed out with every step, flaying the flesh from those too slow to run. It was only when the final kingdom stood on the brink of collapse that the last survivors came together. There was no hope of defeating him. Even the greatest warriors, the mightiest sorcerers, had been reduced to ash in his wake. But they had one last chance. The scrolls spoke of the gods' first war against Vorak. of the single moment in which they had turned the tide. It had not been strength that sealed him away. It had been sacrifice. A soul offered willingly, strong enough to bind the unbindable. And so, on the final night of the world, a lone warrior stepped forward. Her name was Seraphine, the last sentinel. She walked toward Vorik not as a challenger, but as a martyr. In her hands, she held no blade, no shield, only the weight of fate itself. The gods had been silent for too long. She would force them to see. As the warlord raised his weapon, ready to strike her from existence, she whispered the words of the first binding. The air shook, the sky ripped apart, and from the void beyond the stars they returned. The gods had been waiting for one final war